Hey gamers, welcome to ALLCADE, and today we're talking about game saves. Alright, so for today's demo we're using the ALLCADE 64-bit. That is because this system natively supports 64, 16, 8-bit, all the platforms. So it allows me to show you how to do the saves in different platforms without changing systems. So, as normally, we're starting with a brand new system. So if you were to just receive your own, it would be exactly like this. So I'll show you how to get it started and how to get into it, and of course, how to save your games. So we start, of course, just by plugging our HDMI to our TV right into the bottom there, giving it power, and hitting the little switch here to turn it on. And then that little red light tells us it's got power and it's working. So let's see what it's doing. Should boot up in less than 13 seconds. And of course, with a brand new system, it shows us our menu icons and then just the 64 controller there. And of course, there's one game in there, our game that we created, where Minesweeper meets Zelda in a, in a ridiculous adventure with alcohol jokes and cats playing with landmines and all sorts of fun stuff. But today we're going to be using games designed and made for these platforms in their own generation. So let's get into that. So we're going to switch over to my computer real quick and grab a couple of my favorite games. So we're going to show you two examples. We're going to show you a 64-bit system. So for that we're going to use Mario 64, as well as an 8-bit, because the 8-bit platforms never had the ability to save natively. There were a few games that gave you some like kind of weird ways of like using codes and things to save, but you couldn't save your exact state, which of course with modern technology you can. So we're going to grab Mario 64. We're also going to grab Super Mario Bros. 3. We're just going to copy those over to our memory card. It's going to ask us if we want to keep it, like, use all the properties, like save all, or copy all the properties over with files. We just say yes, and just like so, we have our games on the card. So we're going to just unplug that, plug our memory card into one of the two USB ports on the device, and that little red light will change to purple, and then back to red. And that shows us that the games are installing, which of course if we switch over to the system itself, because these are brand new platforms for this system, it's going to restart and show us that extra controller. So now we don't have just 64-bit, we have 64-bit and 8-bit because we just added an 8-bit game. So there we go, that's done. I can now remove our memory card and plug a controller in. So let's start with the 8-bit game. And because I have the ability to, I'm just going to play with an 8-bit controller, get the real feel. But of course, you could play this with a 64-bit controller using your just A, B, and start, as well as a C button to use select. So let's get plugged in. It recognizes our joypad right at the bottom there, and let's get into the game. So when I was playing this game as a kid, my brother and I would take turns, on two-player mode. And we'd get a good distance. We'd get to like level 6 or 7 because we only knew where one warp whistle was. And then of course it'd be time for dinner, or our mom would say, "All right, you've played too much today. Go play outside," or whatever it is. And we weren't able to continue playing. And back then, our only choice was to pause it and hope that a day or two later it hadn't restarted on us. Or frozen, or whatever the case may be. Those good old like colorful lines that you got back in the 80s, 90s on these platforms. With this system though, with a modern system and with our emulated system, we are able to simply press start and select at the same time, which brings into our live menu on this controller. If you're using a 64-bit controller, it would be start and trigger at the same time. And that brings into our live menu. We can go down, just save, pick a slot. So let's pick slot 3, doesn't matter. If you had siblings, every sibling could have their own slot, so you don't mess with each other. Save a state, and just like that, I have saved that exact point in time. So if I was to close out of this game, start another game, restart the system, whatever the case may be, I would be able to come back to that exact moment in time. So that's kind of the nice way to describe it, right? Where you if you're an adult and you actually have jobs and responsibilities now, you probably can't just, play 8 hours, 12 hours straight anymore. So the ability to save and come back later is valuable. But of course, you can also use it to just, if you find yourself getting in a sticky situation, you can just save a state. And then if something goes terribly wrong and you take damage or whatever the case may be, you could just load back that state, be exactly where you were, and give it another shot. So you could just keep trying as many times as you needed to before you got it right, which seems to just not be possible for me today. Now, just to kind of emphasize the point here, I'm going to save one more state. Come down here, go to save state 3, save that state, go in. Level 3, this is where the first warp whistle is hidden, of course. So now I've made some good progress. I can save this, and now let's say it was dinner time. I could just shut the system off, so I'll just show you that now. So here's the system. I'm just going to power it right off. I'll unplug it to prove the point. We're going to start it back up, let it load for a couple of seconds, show you back what the TV's doing here. It's booting right back up from scratch. Go back to my game, move it back over to save state 3, load state, and here I am in the clouds ready to go again. So whether you use it to cheat and just be able to beat that impossible level that you could never make it through when you were a kid, or whether you use it to save and actually get some legitimate progress, this saves the exact position that you were in, and gives the ability to pause any point and come back to that exact moment. So this works on all platforms, whether that platform was allowed to save in its current generation or not. So like 8-bit cannot save, so you have to do this. 64-bit did have a legitimate means of saving, but you can still do this as well. Let's get that warp whistle just because we can. I'm going to swap over to my 64-bit controller, as we're going to be getting into a 64-bit game here right away. And I'm just going to keep playing with this controller. And now, of course, with that warp whistle, I can shoot forwards into new places. Just like so. Jumbo World. So start and trigger together with 64-bit controller. That brings you to the live menu. We're going to leave out of here, and we're going to go into Mario 64. So with an N64, there was always the ability to save, but your position where you could save was dependent on the system or on the game you were playing. So some games allowed you to save more regularly. Some games would only allow you to save when you were outside of a level. So if you want to play the exact way that the console allowed you to back then, that is an option. You can absolutely do that. But the mode I showed you earlier also works. So you can still do start and trigger at the same time, pick a save state, save that position, and keep going. You just have to remember that that save state basically just allocates what's happening in RAM, what's happening in that game, and saves it to a position. So if I save in save state 3 again, my Mario 3 game has now been overwritten. So what you save into a save state only works in that game. So you do need to remember what games you saved in what slots. But there's more than enough slots. Like there's like well over 20 plus slots. So there's no limit, no realistic limit for a single person as far as saving game positions and things. I got to remember, of course, now that I'm playing a legitimate 64 game, I need to remember that that I have to use the analog instead of the D-pad. So if I was to just shut off the system right now, back in the old days, the N64 would remember kind of what that position was, remember your last state and whatever amount of flash memory it had, and that would be recorded. With our system, when you shut down, it does just shut down. So if you want to get a proper save, you do have to exit the game, and I'll show you that here as soon as I have something worth saving. But yeah, just something to keep in mind. Ooh. How many tries do you think it'll take me to... There we go. First try, look at that. This is another game I played a lot growing up. And here we go. So now as soon as I have a star in this game, of course this is game dependent, as soon as I have a star in this game, it actually gives me the choice of whether I want to save. So I'm going to save and continue. Now, I'm just going to reiterate, if I just shut off the system, if I just hit the power button right now, it will not save. However, I have two options. I can do what I just showed you in the 8-bit. I can go down to save state, and I can save it that way. Or I can just hit close. And if I close the system out, that's equivalent to actually hitting the power switch on an N64 and shutting it down the way it normally would. So now that the system has been closed down properly, I could go into other games, I could do whatever I wanted, but I can also power off the system, physically power off the system, no light, power the system back on, get that light back there, and now I can just go into the game and it will save my last position. And this method will work with any console and any game that allowed in-game saving. So as long as you close down the system as if you were turning off the game console, not just shutting off power to the entire emulation platform, it will save your last state. And there we go, Mario A, 1 star. So it saves, it remembers that I had 1 star, it remembers who I am, and it saves exactly as the N64 would have saved. But if I want to save an exact position, I'll just do one as an example here. There's nothing stopping me from coming down here, picking a new slot, saving. Because it's an N64, it has more RAM to save, so it takes a second or so, but it's still very quick. I can come in here, let it load up there. I can load in, and if I was to drown or if I was to play a game and something went terribly wrong, I could then start and trigger together to go back to the live menu, go down to load state. In the bottom left-hand corner, it will actually tell us the percentage. It tells us how it's loading. Loaded from slot 2. Looks like it's still thinking here. There we go. Seems to be done. Nope, give it another second. And there we go. So because they are bigger games, it takes a little bit more loading. You got to wait a little bit with the bigger systems, but it works just like that. So there's nothing stopping you from saving exact locations if you choose to, whether you're using that in a cheap way or just an effective way to save and come back to your state. But with systems that are able to save inherently, as long as you press start and trigger, come down and actually close out of that title, it will save correctly. So that's a quick hash of how saving works on these different platforms. I hope you've got all you need out of it. I hope we've showed you how easy it can be with our platform. And yeah, we'll have more videos with more topics coming soon. Thanks for watching.